Good morning, everybody. I think it's letting people in. I'm going to give it just a little bit to do that. My name is Kara Poli, and I am a compliance monitor with the multifamily division or multifamily compliance division of the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I have got Amy Hammond here, who is the manager of multifamily or of the compliance monitoring. She's going to help with the questions and answer box. And then Wendy Quackenbush, the director of multifamily compliance, is here with us as well. And she's here as support if you guys have questions that we need her feedback on. This training is going to be specific to the multifamily compliance division. So if you are part of another program and you signed up because you saw compliance in the listserv announcement and the email, this may or may not benefit you, but you are welcome to stay. Just understand that we may not be able to answer questions about your specific programs because we are only going to be able to answer questions about what we monitor, but you're welcome to stay, like I said, and enjoy the webinar. Might learn something new, you never know. So the topic of this month's webinar is supportive services. We get a lot of questions about supportive services. We get a lot of feedback from you guys that you would like more information and more resources about supportive services. So we've done this at least once before. I can't remember if we've done it more than once, but we wanted to kind of update that since we're still getting lots of questions and do kind of a live webinar about it. And if you have questions, feel free to put those in the questions box. If they are questions that don't pertain to supportive services, Amy might say, hey, let's table that until we get to the open forum office hours, which will start at about 10:30. We will take a little break between the supportive services webinar and the office hours so that we can kind of, I can reset my PowerPoints and everything. But we do have that open forum immediately following this. We do have some polls during this webinar, so I hope that you'll stay with us and participate in those because I think they're beneficial. You should have received the handout by email unless you registered after 8 a.m. this morning, in which case you can get the handout. There are 2 handouts as well as the supportive services rule available in the handouts section of your GoToMeeting platform. If you don't see that, you can click the view button at the top and maybe make sure the check mark next to handouts is there. If it is, then you should be able to see handouts. If it's not, click it and then the handouts should become available. If you can't see them or you need anything afterwards, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to send that to you through email. Without further ado, we will get started. So supportive services are something that lots of properties have to do. They're not just for tax credit anymore. So this is not just a tax credit and bond type training. This is going to be a webinar that benefits all programs or a lot of the programs under the multifamily compliance umbrella. Just some contact information. I know you guys see this in every webinar that we do. We've got our mailing address. So if you ever needed to mail us something, that's the address you're going to use. If you wanted to drive by and see where the magic happens, that's this East 11th address. A lot of us do not work from the office every single day. A lot of us do work remotely and we do travel. So if you're thinking you're going to go by there and see lots of compliance monitors, that may or may not be the case because a lot of us are not there on a regular daily basis. The best way to reach us is going to be through email and then our website, and you'll notice that it's changed. So if you have not done a webinar with me recently or you have not had a whole lot of email correspondence with us, you may not have noticed that our website has changed, but our website is new. It is a little bit different. If you have questions about how to navigate it, feel free to reach out to a monitor. Myself or Amy are happy to help with that if you can't find something specific. It's pretty easy to navigate once you kind of get in there and mess around a little bit. There also is a search box at the top that is super helpful. You can type in what you need and it takes you to it. So it might take a minute, but it definitely is a usable and helpful search engine. If you need to reach somebody in multifamily compliance and you're not sure who, you can dial this 512 number and you can just ask to be connected to a compliance monitor, or you can leave a voicemail in the general mailbox. And that way we can get back to you as soon as that voicemail is forwarded out. That's kind of how that works. If you need to use a toll-free number, you can use that 1-800 number there. That's toll-free in Texas only. Some terms and definitions that we're going to use throughout the day. We are going to talk about the land use restriction agreement, which I try to say the whole name, but sometimes I might slip up and call this a LURA, and that is the acronym for that. This is the document that outlines what's required under each program for each development. So if your development has multiple programs, you're going to have multiple land use restriction agreements, and you may have different requirements with regards to supportive services or other items that are listed in that LURA. And like I said, the development may have more than one LURA based on funding sources, and you may have multiple LURAs if you've gotten a new award of funds on top of an old award that maybe, you know, is getting close to expiring, that sort of thing. Supportive services or social services, they're kind of interchangeable. I'm probably going to call them supportive services just because that's what's in my brain. But these are the resident events and services that are held with regards to program requirements under what the development operates. So a bond regulatory agreement might have different requirements than a housing tax credit LURA, which might have different requirements than a home LURA. So if you have multiple funding sources, you're going to have to look at all of those funding sources, and they're not necessarily going to satisfy each other. You may have to kind of compare and contrast. I know we all learned how to do that, and we didn't think we were going to ever need it again, but here it is, 2024, I forgot what year it was, and we are going to compare and contrast. So some programs we're going to talk about today are the housing tax credit program, the bond program, the exchange program, and multifamily direct loan programs like Home ARP, TCAP RF, and National Housing Trust Fund. With regards to the monitoring of supportive services, if a development's LURA requires the provision of supportive services, the department is going to confirm that the requirement is being met in accordance with the land use restriction agreement. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the land use restriction agreement information. We're going to take a look at what you submit, and we're going to compare the two. And what I do is I make a list of what you've told me you're offering. I make a list of how those, and as I get to them and I say, oh, that's satisfied, yep, that meets it, I put a note next to it with what the points are so that I can say, I can add those up and say, yep, they're meeting their 10 points or their 8 points or whatever the case may be. Owners are required to maintain sufficient documentation to evidence that services are being provided. The documentation is going to be reviewed during monitoring reviews, beginning with the first review. With regards to the first review, you can submit a plan. You can say, hey, we are in lease up. We just started. We've done a couple of services, but here's our next 3 months calendars and what we're going to do going forward. Or, hey, we just got to where we've got a services provider. We're just starting. Here's our plan for the upcoming 12 months. You send us the calendars and we're going to look at that. And that's going to suffice for that first monitoring review. Evidence of supportive services needs to be able to be provided to the department upon request. I know lots of companies have that scanned in at the end of every month, and then they kind of put it together with services in one big PDF document. That's fine, however you want to have that organized, but it will need to be submitted digitally to the department. If the development's land use restriction agreement or regulatory agreement requires a monthly expenditure for the provision of services, the department is going to monitor that expenditure and confirm compliance. So you're going to have to submit an invoice that shows how much you spent and that sort of thing. So in addition to sign-in sheets, flyers, calendars, you're going to have, probably some sort of agreement that you've got with the provider and how much that costs per month. Amy, are there any questions before we keep going? Okay. So like I said at the very beginning, supportive services are no longer just for tax credit and bond. They are now going to be found in lots of other land use restriction agreements. So if you got home funds in the last couple of years, or you're about to get some home funds for one of your developments or for your development, you may want to read through that land use restriction agreement because it may have the requirement of supportive services. Same thing with those other funding sources. You may now have a multifamily direct loan program that is going to require supportive services, and in years past, you may have been able to say, oh, that's got home. I don't have supportive services there. I don't have to think about that. But now our compliance brains have to shift gears and turn on the supportive services part for a lot of those other programs. And the land use restriction agreement is pretty clear. We're going to look at some examples of that. So don't panic on me. And if you're If you have like a home land use restriction agreement and it doesn't require supportive services, don't think that I'm telling you you have to do them anyway. I'm telling you that whatever your LURA requires is what you need to be prepared to offer. And if your land use restriction agreement or LURA does not require supportive services, that is not going to be something we would look for during a monitoring review. So the services are outlined in the qualified allocation plan. There are requirements set forth in the QAP or qualified allocation plan that tells how the properties have to be, how the application process has to go and kind of what has to be included. So if you're thinking, oh man, why did my owner pick this? Might have been a year where it was super competitive and they had to pick something to kind of add some points to their application, or the qualified allocation plan may have changed. Like this most recent one required bond properties, and Amy can correct me if I say this wrong, required bond properties to also have home match units at their property. So that's a change that came from a qualified allocation plan and a requirement that now folks are going to have to pay attention to kind of two different program types. Annually, that QAP is going to get updated and it's going to have the supportive services available during that qualifying year. And so if you needed more backup, maybe you're an older property and you've got a LURA that's not quite as detailed as some of the newer ones, you can go back to that QAP from that application year and you can see what the background was, what was the intention, where did this come from? And I'm going to show you what some of those look like as well. The full code can be found online at our website. And if that link doesn't work or you don't want to copy and paste it, you can go to our website and type in multifamily. I believe you can put in NOFA and it will get you to this section of the website. So here's what the qualified allocation plan looked like in 2006. You can see it's very short. It's just a little section about supportive services that are required. So the plans that we see from that are going to look a little bit different than what we see in the 2020, 2022, so on and so forth, land use restriction agreements. Here's an example from 2012 and 2013. We got a little bit more, or actually a lot more, detailed in the QAP, and it actually lists out quite a lot more stuff in there, but it doesn't, I didn't have room to put it on the slide, but if you want to see the whole QAP, I can get that to you, or you can find it on our website. And then you can see the 2024 QAP, and this is just a snippet of it where it talks about the supportive services, and it goes on for several pages and looks kind of like the section in the newer land use restriction agreements, where it's got lots of pages with lots of resources and lots of options that you can choose from, which I think, having been a property manager under one of those land use restriction agreements that told me I had 4 things that I had to offer and I did not have any choice, now looking at these land use restriction agreements where you can meet a points requirement and you can change those if folks are not attending, that I think is super fantastic, because you can look at your tenant population and say, okay, well, financial planning doesn't seem to be something they're interested in, but maybe they would rather have annual tax refund prep or something like that. So you can kind of look at it and swap those points values out if something's not beneficial to your property. So we have our first poll. The question is, only housing tax credit developments have supportive services requirements, true or false? I'm going to launch this poll and it's going to take the PowerPoint away and it's going to show you the poll. If you want to answer, I'll give it just a second. Hope everybody's got good weather where you are. Rained a little bit here this morning, but now it looks like the sun's coming out. Amy, do we have any questions while we've got the poll running?
Nope, nothing yet.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna leave that open for just a little bit longer. Thank you guys for voting. I love that. All right, so it looks like almost all of you agree that this is false, and that is correct. In some cases, there are going to be other program types that have supportive services. So, in order to change your supportive services, and we're going to look at, like I said, some different LURA types. So I'm kind of setting all this up, and then we'll look at LURA types and kind of go, example with those. There may be some cases where you have to go through board approval and do a LURA amendment. There may be some cases where you don't have to, but you're going to need to be aware of what type of land use restriction agreement you have, and you're going to need to maybe check with a compliance monitor or asset management to see if you're going to have to go through that amendment process to change your supportive services. It is not necessary to obtain prior written approval to change the provider of the services unless the scope of services is being changed. So if you have to offer health and wellness seminars through a nonprofit, and initially that nonprofit was Poli Nursing Services, and that's 15 years old, and now Poli Nursing Services is dissolved, and you found another nonprofit that offers the same thing, you don't have to have our approval for that. But if you say, you know what, nobody comes to these health and wellness seminars, I don't want to offer that anymore, then you have to get a LURA amendment, because now you're changing the scope of the supportive services, not just the provider. Failure to comply with the requirements of that section will result in a finding of, or an issue of non-compliance, and that would be addressed during a monitoring review, or sometimes during a complaint if we get a call from a tenant or a group of tenants that says, hey, they're supposed to be doing this, they're not, they're telling y'all they are, they're telling us that they don't have time, or whatever the case may be. So be sure that whatever services are required, you are offering those or going through the right process to change those. If there are required monthly expenditures, we will monitor that during the monitoring reviews that you guys will have to make sure that you're meeting that cost threshold. Includable costs support the expenditure. You can include the costs directly related to providing the services. That can be the cost of contracting for services, the cost of notification, like a monthly newsletter, or other costs that can be documented and would not be incurred unless the service was offered. An owner cannot include any costs related to the normal expense of maintaining or operating the development. Like, you can't charge the utility bill for the clubhouse if you're having a service in the clubhouse. You would have had the lights on anyway. You can't charge for the copy machine because you're going to have a copy machine in your office anyway, that sort of thing. You can't say, oh, well, we had to pay to have the office cleaned because we were having this service. You should have been having the office cleaned anyway. So that kind of stuff is not an allowable expense. That list is not exhaustive that you see there, but it is, kind of some good thinking points for what you could or could not include with your monthly expenditure. So we have another poll here. So we've got an owner that has 250 units. 40% of those are required to be at 60%, with 100% of the units reserved as eligible tenants, and this would be a bond program requirement. The cost per unit required is $10. How much is the owner required to expend monthly? I'm going to launch that poll. And while that's up, and Amy can correct me if I am wrong on this, the bond requirements don't go away the same way like your tax credit requirements would go away. So if you're layered with bond and you have bond supportive services requirements, you're going to have to keep offering those even if you might have completed your federal compliance period under your tax credit program. So those are not going to be something that just go away. So you want to keep an eye on that. That's another area where that layering of programs might change. And then some of our, especially our newer tax credit land use restriction agreements, require services offered through the term of the LURA or through the extended use period, not just through the compliance period. So we're going to look at some examples of those, but that's information that you're going to want to be aware of and make sure staff is aware of, so they don't say, oh, we're post 15 now, we don't have to do that at all. All right, I'm going to leave that up a little bit longer since there's math involved. Amy, do we have any questions so far?
Nothing as of yet.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. Looks like the answers are kind of dying down. And you guys were kind of torn between 250 and 2,500. So the answer is 2,500 per month. If you've got to charge $10 per unit for 250 units, that's 2,500 per month. That's just an example. Yours may not have an expenditure. You may not even have the bond program that would require this. You may have a different monthly expenditure. I think I've seen $7, I've seen $10, I've seen $5. So just is going to depend on what your regulatory agreement for that bond program has. Some tips and tricks to be successful with supportive services. Make sure that you are familiar with the development's land use restriction agreement and the supportive services required therein. So you want to be sure, if you are new to a property or you've been there for a little bit, but you say, well, man, Kara's talking about this land use restriction agreement, I've never seen mine. You may want to reach out to your compliance division or your ownership group and say, hey, can I get a copy of the LURA? I need to know specifically what's required for this development. How often do I have to offer it? That sort of thing. If you can't find one, you are welcome to reach out to us, and what we can do is upload it into the compliance monitoring tracking system if it's not already there. You'll also want to look for any LURA amendments, because sometimes those do change the supportive services, depending on what the reason for the amendment was and kind of what scope that had. You want to be sure that you are advertising effectively with your tenants about the available service. If on-site is excited and energetic, if on-site staff is excited and energetic about the services, then your tenants are going to be excited too. They're going to feel that energy and be more interested in attending the event. It's a good idea to send out monthly notifications like a newsletter or a calendar or flyers that kind of say, here's what we've got going on this month. If you have social media platforms, it's great to put these events there and let folks RSVP through the social media, or just make them aware that if they follow you. You can also use any other avenues available to the development to publicize the services being held at the property. If you throw out that there's going to be snacks, you might have better attendance. So just an idea, but you want to be sure that you are communicating to your staff in an effective way so that you can get kind of the most return on that offering of supportive services. You want to also make sure that you properly document everything, even if there's no attendees. So if nobody comes, you should still have a calendar or something that told your tenants about it. You should still have the flyer that went out if you did a flyer, or support it, or the social media platform. You could print that out if you had a Facebook event or something like that. And then you should still have a sign-in sheet, and it should have nobody on there, and maybe your supportive services provider or your on-site manager signs and says no attendees, and they sign their name. You know, like I said, I was on site for a long time, and I know that not everybody comes to the services, and sometimes you have events where nobody comes. But that still needs to be documented, and that still needs to be effective, that we can tell that you offered the event and that it was not attended by your on-site folks. So now we're going to talk about the who, what, where, and when of supportive services. We've kind of been talking about the why, but now we're going to talk about specifically who has to provide the supportive services. What services are required for the specific development? Where are the services to be conducted? And when is the service to be offered? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually? Some LURAs outline this specifically per service, some don't. So you're going to have to be aware of that. And for some of you, you guys are in a compliance capacity, and you've got properties from the early 2000s that have a different set of requirements than those that are getting funded now. So you kind of are running the gamut there, and you want to be sure that you're not saying, oh, well, that property is the same funding as this one, it's going to be the same type of stuff. That's probably not going to be true unless they were funded under the exact same QAP at the exact same time and with the exact same requirements, because every property seems to have a little bit different kind of setup with regards to supportive services, especially on those older LURAs where it's specific to what services can be offered. So with regards to the who to provide supportive services, That's going to be outlined in your land use restriction agreement if that's a requirement. So you can see that first box is one of the newer land use restriction agreements. It doesn't have it outlined there because it's going to have it with each service that's going to say, you know, income tax preparation with a qualified tax professional, GED classes with a qualified teacher, that sort of thing. It's going to be outlined, and we're going to look at that in just a second. The next one you can see has to be held through a local tax exempt organization, and you're going to need to be able to show us that when we come out to monitor. And they're going to offer health and wellness services. And if Visiting Nurse Association has gone out of business or is no longer willing to work with you, and you've gotten another group, then you would need to be able to show, hey, they stopped, this one started, we're still doing it, they're still a local tax exempt organization that's offering it. Then the next one says that the owner's contracted for the following supportive services. It lists out the supportive services, and the organization providing it is Community Action Agency of San Patricio County. If that agency has gone away and a different agency is now helping with the services, that's okay. You're just going to need to show us that the shift happened and why it happened, and that now you've got this other company or this other contracted group providing the supportive services. Any questions yet, Amy? Awesome.
Yes, we have a few, and they're really good ones, so I'm excited. The first one says, what if we get all the excitement in place for our service and we prep for it and we still get no participation?
So that's going to happen. You're going to be all amped up. You're going to have tenants that you see when they're paying rent and they say, oh yeah, we're going to come. And then lo and behold, nobody comes. You still have to offer the service. You definitely don't want to let that dampen your future offerings, because maybe it was just kind of a bad day. Maybe everybody's kid got in trouble at school or got sick at school. Like right now, everybody's getting sent home with some sort of strep or flu or something. Maybe it just didn't work out that day, but it might work out again in the future. The other thing is, maybe you want to survey your tenants and say, hey, we've noticed that nobody's coming to these services that we're offering for you. As a survey to the tenants, what's a better time for you to have this? Would you be more inclined to come to a service that's offered at 4:30, or is it like that one day a week or one day a month you stay open and have whatever service it is at 5:30, that kind of thing? Because if a lot of your tenants work during the day, they're not going to be able to come to a service at 9 a.m. in your office. So even though they might want to, they're not going to be able to. So there's lots of steps that might go into that, but you still need to document that the service was offered and held, and you still need to have the sign-in sheet showing that nobody attended and be able to provide that to us when we have a monitoring review.
Awesome. So the next one is, if we post our event on social media, can we indicate that it is only for the residents?
Yes, you can indicate that this event is for residents only, and then have a process in place to confirm that. I can see where certain events, other folks might show up, but if they're potential residents or they're friends of a resident and they come with that resident, I don't know that I would turn them away necessarily, but that's something that you guys can look at kind of within your company and kind of figure out how you want to handle that.
And the last one is, if you are located in an area that has access to other services across the driveway, across the parking space, and events can be held there. For example, you have Texas Workforce Commission and it's located across your parking lot. Can you have a social event there that includes touring the Texas Workforce location?
I think, and Amy will correct me if I'm giving y'all bad information, I think that if it shares a parking lot and you could say, hey, everybody meet here, we're going to talk about it first, and then we're going to go over, if you would like to tour the Texas Workforce Commission and find out how to utilize those resources. I don't think that's a problem. I know some of these offices are all in the same building even in some cases. So I don't think that would necessarily be a problem. But if you are saying, oh, Texas Workforce Commission is several blocks away and we're going to walk, I think that's where you get into a problem. If it's, you know, no different than them walking to get their mailbox. I think that's okay. But if you're asking them to leave the general vicinity of the property, then it's no longer on site and it would need to have transportation provided. Would you disagree with that, Amy, or you think that would be? Okay. That get all our questions? Perfect. Good questions, guys. That is why we are offering these, so you guys can ask all the things. So another example of who is going to provide your supportive services, in 2006 and 2007 allocations, you may have this box checked saying that you have to coordinate with state programs like the Workforce Development Group or the welfare programs available in Texas. This might mean that you have to reach out to those entities, and you're going to need to show us that you reached out to them, especially if they kind of give you the runaround about working with you on supportive services. You may need to have some conversations and say, hey, this is required. We're in this program. We can do it, you know, however often, or just have them, you know, I had this in one of the LURAs that I had to operate under, and, you know, we had them come out quarterly, I think was what ours allowed for. And it worked out okay. They came out. We usually had a handful of people that came and said, hey, I want to know how to search for jobs in Texas. And, you know, that was able to work for what my property had to require. So you're going to have to look at this and find the services that your folks that you can coordinate with those state workforce development and welfare groups. But if you have a LURA that has this box and it's not checked or X'd, you don't have to have that special requirement. So if you were allocated in that 06-07 timeframe, and this is in your land use restriction agreement, but it's not marked on the box, you don't have to requirement. If the box is marked, then this is something we would look at during a monitoring review. There is a newer provision of supportive services that's required, where the owners were given an additional point during the application process to have an outreach and education supportive service that's available. And this is pulled out. It is underneath the regular supportive services for your property. So this is not listed in there. This is a separate, kind of separate, but the same treatment, and you've got to have it as a separate event. It's not going to satisfy one of your other events. So you're going to have to make contact with a local nonprofit and government provider of services that would support the health and well-being of the development's tenants. I have seen folks satisfy this a number of ways. I think for the most part, the folks that are doing this are getting it covered. And I think our website has a list of providers on it that you can get to. You can, in the little search box, you can put, I'm trying to think what it's called. I think it's service providers, and that'll get you there. If you can't find it, reach out to me and I can get you that link directly. But if your land use restriction agreement requires this and you don't submit the information about it when you submit for your monitoring review documentation, it's going to be something that is going to be an issue of non-compliance when we write our monitoring report. And this is something that really can benefit your tenants, at least in the ways that I have seen it handled. It can really benefit your tenants because it's folks coming to your office, to your tenants, and offering them those services that they might not know exist or might not be able to get to, that sort of thing. So the next part we're going to talk about are what supportive services are going to be provided. So remember at the beginning when I said if you're going to change it substantially, you've got to get a LURA amendment. So if your supportive services in your LURA look like this, and it says specifically that you have to have financial planning assistance, health screening services, and health and nutritional courses, you can't change those just because nobody's coming. You're going to have to do, or your owner is going to have to do a LURA amendment to change those supportive services. But if your LURA looks like this second one or has points values, the newer LURAs are much longer, and I wanted to be sure I got lots of things on there. You are able to say, okay, I've got to do 9 points of service. So I'm doing weekday character building, I'm doing daily transportation, I'm doing weekly exercise classes, and I've got a notary service. I think that gets us to 9. So that gets us to 9 points. But then you realize that your weekday character stuff, nobody's coming to. And you want to swap that out with quarterly financial planning and an annual health fair. That's fine, as long as that shift happens. And at any point in time, You are always offering 9 points of service. It's got to be 9 all the time, not 9, by the end of the year, or how I've had some folks do some creative math on that. But at any point in time, if we come out to monitor or we get a complaint and we request supportive services from you, you need to be showing us that at any point in time you are offering 9 points of service if your land use restriction agreement looks like this. But if you realize, hey, nobody's using daily transportation, it's costing us a lot to maintain this van, we're going to swap that out for some other things. That's perfectly fine if your LURA looks like this, because you're just required to do the points amount. You're not required to do specific services. Any questions? Are we still? Okay. So the next piece is where the supportive services are to be held. Supportive services have to be held on site, or transportation has to be provided to off-site services. So if your land use restriction agreement does not have that sentence in there, I can almost assure you that the QAP from your award year has that in there. This has always been the intention of supportive services. This has always been the requirement, and this has always been how we would look for that. Like I said, as with other things, everybody gets a little better every time we do a new version of something, and we've gotten a little clearer and cleaner in the information that we're sharing through the QAP and through the land use restriction agreement. But they need to be on site. Your tenants don't need to walk further than where they go. My answer always is, if they have to go further than where they go get their mail, then you've got an issue, because they're leaving the site. If you have 2 phases and both phases require supportive services, but you only offer them at phase 1, that's a problem. You need to also offer them at phase 2. Phase 2 probably has a clubhouse of some sort, and even though you may office out of phase 1, you need to offer your phase 2 required services in that phase 2 clubhouse. So that may determine what you're offering. You may offer the same things for both, but you need to be offering them in both locations. So the next piece is, when do I have to offer them? Some of the LURAs, like we looked at on this first one, it doesn't say. Oh, sorry about that. It doesn't say. It doesn't say a quarterly financial planning assistance, or a monthly health screening service, or quarterly health and nutritional courses. It just says they have to be available to tenants. So we're going to say that as long as you can show us that you had that in the 12 months prior or whatever, we're going to say that you've satisfied that requirement. But this one says weekday character building program. So if you send in documentation and you're doing that on a Saturday, I'm not satisfying that, because it has to be a weekday. Daily transportation, that means any day of the week, they've got to be able to get where they want to get through your transportation offering. Food pantry on at least a monthly basis. You need to have that in your plan. It needs to be able to show that it's happened monthly. Quarterly financial planning courses. You need to be able to show us that you've had that in quarter 1, and then you've had it in quarter 2, or you've got it scheduled in quarter 2. Annual health fair, quarterly health and nutritional courses, scholastic tutoring that's daily, Monday through Thursday. If I see that on a Saturday, I'm not going to count it. That needs to be as prescribed, Monday through Thursday. Notary service during regular business hours, weekly exercise classes, that kind of thing. So some of these newer LURAs are going to have the details about how often a service is to be offered, or when a service is to be offered. So the next topic, unless there are questions on the who, what, when, or where, we are going to talk about how long do you have to provide the supportive services. Now, the ones we're looking at right here, those are tax credit land use restriction agreements. We're going to look at the other program ones here in just a second as well. But remember, I said some of them have an end and some of them do not. So if the land use restriction agreement requires that they are offered throughout the compliance period, you've got to offer them for at least that 15-year compliance period for a housing tax credit development. If it says through the extended use period, that means it's through the end of the LURA term. So if you've got a 55-year land use restriction agreement, you're going to be doing services for 55 years. If you have an extended compliance period, you are going to have to offer them, like in this example, it's not just going to be for 15 years, it's going to be for 25 consecutive taxable years. then we're going to say, okay, they've got a longer compliance period. So anything in the land use restriction agreement that's required through the compliance period has to go for 25 years. And if you're not sure if yours has that, or you're not sure how to interpret it or how to do the math on the dates, feel free to reach out to a monitor and we are happy to help you kind of figure that out. Here is what the bond regulatory agreement is going to look like with regards to supportive services. There's a list. It says it doesn't have an end date, so you're going to do it through the end of the term of the bond regulatory agreement. It's going to tell you in Exhibit C, in some cases, this is a newer regulatory agreement, that you've got to have services and they've got points values. So this property has to do 8 points. You can see I've highlighted those points there. There's some different offerings. And these are a lot more detailed than what that first one looks like. So this one, it's pretty open to interpretation. If credit counseling is credit counseling, it doesn't have the details that this one has under where it says, you know, shuttle at least 3 days a week to a grocery store or pharmacy, that sort of thing. So you need to be aware that newer sources of funding are going to have more detailed or may have more detailed information. And so you don't want to just assume that, oh, I've done bond for years, I know exactly how the bond stuff works, because it might have changed with the newer funding. This is earlier in that Exhibit C, where it says that you've got to provide the services as outlined in the Exhibit C. And you can see that the documentation is going to be reviewed during a monitoring review, beginning with the second on-site review. And then here you can see that the owner has to spend at least $7 per unit for the services listed in Exhibit C. I can tell you based on the font, that one goes with that first Exhibit C, not the second Exhibit C. But newer LURAs still have expenditure requirements as well. So you're not going to want to say, oh, that's a new one, and Kara said we didn't have that. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you've got to read through the regulatory agreement for your bond program and find out if you've got those. And if you're not sure, reach out to a monitor. We can help, or we can help look for that with you. But your compliance folks are going to be a good resource for you that are on site. Ownership might be a good resource for somebody that's new to the compliance and not sure, you know, how that works. But again, if you can't find it or you're not sure, reach out to us and we can help you locate that. For the home resident supportive services, the LURA is going to look similar to what the tax credit ones look like. And it's going to have the resident supportive services. And for this one, it's going to say they must provide 10 points. 9 have to be the services listed A through Z, and 1 point must be required or is required for the owner to contact a local nonprofit and government provider. So it's kind of that same thing we talked about in the tax credit, LURA, where it's got that excerpt. This one has it, but it's in the verbiage. So the key here is to read the land use restriction agreement. You can see here that if you can't charge for the services, they've got to be accessible to all, and they've got to be on site or transportation has to be provided. And then here you can see how the services look. There can be a written agreement with a qualified provider. Property staff and maintenance staff are not going to be considered a qualified provider. So this is very important to know. You can't just say, oh, my manager is going to host, she's going to drive a van for us, or he's going to drive this bus for us to qualify for that transportation. So you're going to need to have those requirements met. And this one says that the same service cannot be used for more than one scoring item. That's not new, but we put it in there. And that has to be provided by a qualified and reputable provider. So that is something that you're going to want to read through and be aware of. Home ARP is going to look very similar. You can see here that it's got, they've got 4 points that are required. And the owner can change, but the overall points selected have to remain in place. So a lot of the same services, same points values, but this owner has to provide 4. Here's the National Housing Trust Fund example. And it has a lot of the same language as far as offering it on site, no fees, reputable provider, can change at time to time because it's got points values. So this provider or this property has to have 8 points so they can do the local law enforcement coordination. They have weekday character building, daily transportation, food pantry, a lot of the same stuff we've been seeing in other ones because the intention is not really to reinvent the wheel, and we would like to make it to where if you have layered properties, you could say, okay, I've got National Housing Trust Fund and housing tax credit. I'm going to satisfy both of the land use restriction agreement requirements, and I'm going to offer these services because you don't have to do 8 for National Housing Trust Fund and 10 for your housing tax credit. 10 for the housing tax credit can probably carry over to cover the requirements for National Housing Trust Fund, but they do need to be offered, and you need to make sure, in case your land use restriction agreement is different, that you are still satisfying those requirements. So I've got another poll here. Supportive services are only required for the first 15 years. True or false?
Kara, there are questions, so while they're answering them, I can ask you the questions.
Awesome, thank you.
If the current land use restriction agreement says a minimum of 6 services, do we still have to follow a point system?
No, that's a good question because I don't think I have that example in here. Some of them are going to have a list, and it's going to be written in paragraph form, so these are a little bit harder to read, in my opinion. And it's going to have the list of services, and it's going to say the owner has to pick 6 or the owner has to pick 4. And you're going to want to make sure that you're picking those. And that would be an instance where you could change the 6 that are offered, but at any point in time, you need to be sure you're offering the 6 required services or however many are required in that land use restriction agreement. But there is not points attached to those.
Okay, the next question is, if you are required to do an event on a monthly basis, you should have documentation that demonstrates it was scheduled for each month. For example, January, February, etc. And not that there were just 12 occurrences of this event in the calendar year.
So if I see that you're supposed to have a monthly food pantry and I'm monitoring your property in March, I'm going to expect to see the January sign-in sheet for the food pantry and a February sign-in sheet for the food pantry, or February and March if you've already held it for March. I'm not going to expect to see the whole last year of service of the food pantry, but I am going to need to see at least a couple of months worth. And then if I have questions, I might ask for more documentation, but I would want to see a couple of months worth. But yes, if it says monthly, that means once during every calendar month, not 12 times during a calendar year. I'm not sure which that question was about, but that answers it both ways.
Yep, that is it. I think that's the answer. And I believe this has to do with bonds. So you said that the services in the bond LURA have no end date, like tax credit. Some depends on, I'm going to kind of give away the answer to this poll, depends on the land use restriction agreement. But will the bond LURAs have different requirements?
Most of the time, no. Most of the time, the bond, in my experience, the bond LURA or the bond regulatory agreement is going to have services that align with the tax credit requirements or with the layered program requirements. So you should still be able to seamlessly continue offering what you were offering, but you would want to take a peek at that bond agreement and make sure that there's not kind of a one-off situation.
And then the last question that I have, oh no, I got another one that popped in. For example, for the food pantry, if we leave it open as needed, can we just have a running sign-in sheet for the entire month?
I don't have a problem with that. I think that would be fine.
I think that that's the best way to probably do a food pantry, to be honest.
I agree. I know there's some properties I've seen that do like a coordination with the food bank, where there's actually like a distribution at their property once a month where their tenants can come to the parking lot and, you know, out of the big box, try to get what they need. But I think that if you have it in your office, I see a lot of folks that have shelves, you know, with the food pantry items. If that's there and that's available, then I think that's great.
This one says, on the quarterly events that are worth 1 point, does that count towards the 10 points per month or just worth 1 point during the current month?
Ooh, that's a good question because I can see where that's a little bit nuanced. when we do a monitoring review, if you have selected quarterly health and nutritional courses as one of your services, you're going to need to show us that that's been done for 2 different quarters. So like the last quarter of 23 and the first quarter of 24, if I was coming out in March or April, is probably what I would want to see. And then maybe you say, oh, that's on our calendar for June also, so that you can kind of evidence that that's continuing. And that would satisfy, that would mean that at that point in time, you were offering those services, and that 1 point is going to qualify for that quarter.
Great. These are really great questions. If the land use restriction agreement does not indicate a time frame, do we just assume that all services are annual?
I don't want to answer that one, Amy. I want you to.
Okay. So the best way, so with some of the older land use restriction agreements do not have the prescribed time. Like it doesn't say that you have to do weekly exercise classes or annual tax returns or quarterly financial classes. It doesn't have those time frames, but it might say that you have to do youth services, financial assistance, and transportation. The way we monitor that is we want it to be reasonable to the service. So if your land use restriction agreement requires that you provide transportation and you only do this once a year, you do a shopping trip to Walmart, we would say that is not sufficient in providing transportation as a supportive service. But if your land use restriction agreement says that you are to do a financial or a credit counseling class and you do that once a year, is that sufficient? It probably would be counted as sufficient. Quarterly would probably be better, but we would probably take an annual on that. Or a health fair, we would say that would be sufficient to do it annually. But youth services, again, would that be reasonable just to have one event a year for youth? No, that would not be reasonable. We would be looking for a more consecutive or more current or more active youth supportive services. So whether that's once a month, once a week, after school tutoring during the school year, and then in the summer, maybe monthly summer activities, that would be appropriate. So we're looking for something that's reasonable and appropriate when the land use restriction agreement does not have a prescribed monthly, quarterly, weekly type of time frame.
Thank you.
Oh, I think this one answers the other question. I think I just answered this question. When it asks for programs, for example, youth program, scholastic tutoring, what is the minimum it has to be offered? So just exactly what I said. If it's not prescribed in the land use restriction agreement, if there's not a time frame tied to that says it, like weekly youth programs, daily scholastic tutoring, then we would want it to be reasonable. So to the service. What preference do auditors require supportive service documents be kept? In a binder, in a digital file?
We're going to talk about that in just a second.
Yeah, I thought. Okay, our next question is, what would fire safety be considered? If we do a fire safety, you don't hear me? Oh, and I lost.
I can now.
Okay. What would fire safety be considered if we do the fire safety course for their kids and their parents?
Well, that's going to depend on what your LURA requires. If your LURA has financial planning, health and nutritional courses, and weekly exercise classes, I could say that's a health and nutritional course because fire safety is a health thing. But if your LURA just requires financial services and youth programs, maybe that meets the youth program for part of it, but it doesn't satisfy it wholly like Amy was talking about. But if your land use restriction agreement only has financial counseling or credit counseling, you did that service as a service to your property, but it doesn't satisfy a LURA requirement. So that would be one where we'd have to look at what was required, look at what you offered. I think it's a great service. If you have to contract with nonprofits and government agencies to provide services to your development, maybe that's, you know, where that one falls. It's just going to depend on what's required.
Okay, so the next one is, and I'll probably take this one, for a RAD conversion, when should services begin? When construction begins or when construction ends? So we do not monitor for the RAD program. So you're probably referencing services that are in your land use restriction agreement for our programs, which would either be bond or housing tax credit, home ARP, National Housing Trust Fund. And in 10.619 of the Texas Administrative Code, subchapter F, compliance monitoring rules, it says that if the development's LURA requires the provision of services, the department will confirm that this requirement is being met in accordance with the LURA. The owners are required to maintain significant documentation to evidence that these services are being provided. Documentation will be reviewed during the monitoring reviews, beginning with the first monitoring review. So you should have your services in place by your first monitoring review. However, if we do come out a little bit early, we like to monitor early rather than later. So we also included in the rule that planned services with a specific date will be counted as evidence of compliance. So as long as you have a service plan in place with specific dates that you're going to offer those at the time of your first review, we count that as sufficient. So the next question, Kara, is, can we set up a food pantry even if it's not required? And if so, do you have any information on how to start or who to contact?
Yes, you can set up a food pantry. And if you want to email me, we can talk through some resources on that, because that might be a little bit too deep for what the topic of this webinar is. But there may be some nonprofits in your area. You may reach out to the actual food bank, that sort of thing, and say, hey, I manage an affordable housing community in your area. I would like to have the food pantry or food services available to my tenants. Is there something we can do? Is there a way we can get that service offered to these tenants on a regular basis? So, but yes, you can offer it even if it's not required. We love that.
We do love that, but please remember that we can't count it towards your services if it's not part of your land use restriction agreement. Because we see lots of great things, especially at senior communities. We see a lot of great additional services, then they're not in the land use restriction agreement. And we think it's great that you're offering these additional services, but we can't count them if they're not part of your land use restriction agreement. So Kara, here's the next one. So if it says that I get 1 point for an annual event, do we get to count that 1 point each month?
If I come out to do a monitoring review and you were supposed to have an annual health fair, what I want to see is, when did it last happen and when is it scheduled for the next time? So if you tell me that in November you did your annual health fair for 2023 and it's scheduled again for November of 24, I'm going to say that you have satisfied that 1 point and that it is not non-compliance. You've had that point satisfied for the year.
And the next one says, if our coordinator has resigned, can we submit a statement that we're hiring and make up for the missed points on the next month?
Oh, if you've selected the 1.5 points that go with having a part-time or full-time court, I would probably say that's okay. I understand people change jobs, and maybe we sent you a monitoring review and your person said, hey, I am leaving this job for whatever reason, and it just lined up, but you've got a job posting and you've got, hey, we're scheduling interviews. We can see that you're doing your due diligence to fill that position. I feel like I would not cite that. Now, if we come out again in 3 years later and you're still trying to fill that position, we might have a problem. But if they just left and that sort of thing. I think it's okay.
Yeah. And can you tell us the difference between a social event and a recreational event?
I would have to look at what the definition is in your land use restriction agreement. If you have a social event in there and it does not have a definition, if you've got an older land use restriction agreement, a social event is truly just an event like you've got Meet Santa, or you have got Easter cookies in the clubhouse, or bingo, that sort of thing. But a lot of our newer land use restriction agreements have definitions kind of in parentheses, that there are certain things that qualify as, the on-site arts and crafts or the on-site social, that sort of thing.
This is a really good one too. The only document that I have on the property is a service agreement between the management company and the apartment complex. Should there be a local copy of the document specifically titled Land Use Restriction Agreement, or does this other document suffice as long as it outlines the services required?
No, I think you should have a copy of your LURA on site. That is not a secret document. That is actually in public record for your county. So if you need a copy of it, or the owner won't provide it to the compliance or to the property staff, that's not something that should not be not shared. That should be shared. That should be a live copy on the property so that your staff can see it and can be aware of what's required of them.
In regards to what if we have two phases and they're close to each other, and due to safety concerns, residents feel safer having health events like a walking group together?
If you're, okay, I can spin this. If you're walking both phases and they meet in the middle to start, I'm not going to cite that. But if everybody always has to meet at phase one and you only walk in phase one, I think that's making phase two residents work harder than the phase one residents. So meet in the middle. I think there's a country song about that.
If we need to make a change or an amendment to our land use restriction agreement about our supportive services, who does this? The property management or the agency who offers the services?
So I think the amendment, and Amy will jump in if I tell y'all the wrong thing. I think the amendments have to be initiated by the owner. You're the owner of the property. It's like saying who can sell your house. Only you as the owner can sell your house. The owner has to change that amendment because it's tied to the land that they own and to the property that they're managing. Or that they're owning. So it needs to be initiated by the owner. But it could definitely be something that the management group or the on-site staff say, hey, I really feel like these supportive services are not what our tenant population wants to see. And I feel like we could do these and better serve our tenant population. And the owner, probably would take that advice, I would hope, and say, okay, I want to better serve my low-income Texan tenants and, begin offering better services for them.
So I think I'm going to take this one. It's if we had a back to school event together with the residents and provided school supplies, what course would that fall under? This is a great example of look at your land use restriction agreement. I can't really answer that because I can't see your land use restriction agreement right now, but take a look at your land use restriction agreement. And if you have a service on there, such as youth services that I was talking about, youth activities and services that I was talking about earlier, and you have to do this monthly, and this is what you do in August. And you say, I'm going to do this in August, and I'm going to put this under my youth services. And you tell us that, then we're going to count it as that. It makes sense that it falls under youth services, and that's what we're going to count it as. And I think Kara talks a little bit about you telling us what services you are providing that meets your land use restriction agreement in a couple slides. Correct, Kara?
Yes. Do we want to keep going through some polls and then come back, or do you have some more questions?
We have just a few more questions.
Okay.
Are there any restrictions on purchasing food for events?
That's going to be up to your local code. I cannot answer that. I would say if you put out snacks, then, you know, for us, that's fine. But you may have local codes that prohibit that, but you're not selling them. So I think it's probably going to be okay.
I think we're all caught up and you can move forward.
Okay. So almost all of you said that this is false. Services are not just required for the first 15 years, which is great. You guys are getting the information and it's sinking in. So, but we've got more polls. So yes, services are going to be required based on the term outlined in your land use restriction agreement or regulatory agreement. Here's another poll. Services must be provided on site or have transportation. True or false? I'll leave this open for just a minute. And I feel like we have driven this home, so hopefully this is in your brains. And I did put the supportive services rule, that TDHCA section 10.619 that Amy referenced a little bit ago. I did put that in the handout section in case anybody wants to see that. All right, I'm gonna leave it open for a few more seconds. You guys are asking great questions. I'm so excited about that. All right, I'm gonna close the poll. Almost all of you said true. This has to be on site for your services to be offered, or you have to provide transportation to get to a different place. So if the GED class you coordinate with is at the library, you need to offer transportation to the library, and not that they get in the manager's car and drive to the library, but it's actual property transportation. Services on site can be changed anytime the development wishes to change them. This is another poll. This one's kind of tricky. Give it just a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that one. Some of you said this is false, and some of you said this is complicated, and that's true. Remember, we talked about how some of the land use restriction agreements cannot be changed without a LURA amendment. Some can be, some are on points values. And then we get the question about what if it just says I have to pick 6 from this list? Every land use restriction agreement is different and may have a different setup, and you're going to have to follow what your LURA requires or allows. How often does a property have to offer their supportive services? Now, if you have one of those land use restriction agreements that doesn't have a prescribed time frame, and you have something that could be, you know, once a year or quarterly maybe would be better, and your owner says, we want you to offer these monthly or we want you to offer these quarterly, they're allowed to do that. That doesn't mean, don't go back and say, hey, Karen, Amy said that we don't have to do this. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that while the LURA doesn't have a prescribed frequency, you need to offer what's reasonable. And if your owner deems financial or credit counseling reasonable to be had once a month, then have it once a month. All right, I'm going to close this one. Almost all of you agree that this depends on the LURA. It's going to tell you, or it's not, and you're going to have to use your better judgment to decide how often something needs to be offered. Are there any other questions, Amy, before we talk about how to implement? Okay. So this is, some of this stuff's going to be repeated, but I think it's very important for you guys to be aware of. The services have to be held free of charge to your tenants. No rent or fees can be charged to the tenants for attending the services. So they can't have to put $2 in a hat to come in and have the credit counseling conversation. The services have to be something that the development's tenants could not readily get on their own. For example, YouTube videos to meet the requirement of adult education would be insufficient because the households can get YouTube on their own. Now, I did get a question yesterday through email that somebody wanted me to bring up today. What if you have been, I guess, as a result of COVID or, you know, maybe your tenant suggestions, you've been offering virtual services, maybe a Zoom meeting, that sort of thing. Could you continue to do that? And I wanted to bring that up while Amy was here so that she could kind of offer some feedback. I think there are some services that you could say, yes, could be done virtually, but scholastic tutoring, there needs to be somebody in the office that the kids can come to the office and get the scholastic tutoring. I think, you know, maybe financial planning, if you have a way to share it in your office through a projector, maybe the banker is, you know, able to do it virtually, but they're not able to come in, and you have a projector and you can share it where your tenants can still come to the office. Because maybe they don't have the internet, maybe they don't have a phone, maybe they don't have a computer at home. The idea is that it is easily and readily available to all tenants. Amy, do you have anything you want to add to that one? Okay. If you're not sure if one of your services can be done virtually and you want to talk about it, email me. I'm happy to kind of talk about that, looking at your actual land use restriction agreement. But that person wanted me to be sure to bring that up. So hopefully they're here and got that information. You also want to keep any documentation that is used to notify the tenant of the services. The department recommends keeping an organized binder or digital file to keep documentation of each service offered and the advertising materials for that service. Your services can be put together by month, they can be put together by service offered, but when I look at them, what I would like to see is a kind of an organized, I did this, and here's the 2 times I offered it most recently. I did this, and here's the backup, which we're going to talk about in just a couple slides, per service. If you don't submit your supportive services backup and we come on site and you hand us a giant binder, we're probably going to say, hey, here's what I'm missing. Please pull that out, scan it, upload it to CMTS. We'll review it before we do your monitoring letter. If you're able to get that in and uploaded, if you're not, then it'll be part of the corrective action review. We don't really have the time or the kind of the setup anymore to look at that stuff on site. A lot of times by the time I come out on site, I am already, you know, done with that monitoring log part, and I'm only looking at checklists while I'm on site. But if you upload it, I can kind of compare to what I've got in my monitoring log. The contract for services, if required, should also be maintained and made available during any monitoring review. And a lot of you don't have the requirement to coordinate services with a provider, but you still send us that provider agreement, which is helpful because a lot of times it lines out what's provided, what's the frequency, and then we can kind of use that to compare to the land use restriction agreement and the sign-in sheets and stuff that you submit. The document supportive services, some things that are helpful: newsletters with calendars of events that are sent to tenants. flyers for specific events that are used to advertise the event to the tenants of the development, and sign-in sheets must be maintained for all events held, even if nobody was there. And if you're thinking outside the box and you have other ways to advertise to your tenants about events, by all means do that if it's effective for your tenants. Like the social media platforms, maybe you have a text service that goes out to everybody, or you have an email blast that goes out. I think those are great. Save the backup for those so you can show us during a monitoring review that this is happening. With regards to pre-review documents, when you receive the notification of a monitoring review, either desk or on-site, the notification letter is going to request that you complete the monitor review questionnaire. We have a training for that too, so I can send that to you if you want to know how that works. This is where the property services need to be outlined. Backup needs to be submitted for those services offered. It's going to say, does your land use restriction agreement require services? You're going to say yes. Then it's going to ask you what service, what do you do? What service, what do you do? And it's got space for lots of services. We're going to look at one in just a second. When you submit the backup, it is helpful if you send us either a copy of the LURA pages or a copy of that agreement with your provider, or just a Word typed list that says we do these 12 things, here are the points value, or these 8 things, depending on what you've got to do. And then you've got to send the flyers and the sign-in sheets and the newsletters and calendars that back all that up. And you can send us the newsletters for the 12 months prior to show the regular offering of services, especially if you're concerned that, hey, I have an annual health fair. I want them to know I did it in March of last year and I'm doing it in March of this year. Send us the calendar for last year, send us the stuff from offering this year, and we're going to be good to go on that. Some documentation, I know we've kind of already gone through this, are the sign-in sheets, notices, calendars, schedules, invoices, contracts, ledgers, and the tax exempt status of the provider if that's required. What we want to see uploaded into CMTS is not every sheet of paper from that 12 months in your supportive services binder, but we would like to see evidence of the 2 most recent consecutive services. So if it's monthly, we want to see the last 2 months that you offered it. Quarterly, the last 2 quarters. Weekly, 2 weeks worth. Weekday, 2 weeks worth. If it's annual, we want to see the last one and we want to know when the next one's scheduled. That sort of thing. The development can also submit an outline that shows what they have planned for the year or what they've got, what they did in the past year, that sort of thing. Anything you think that's going to help show what you did. And a lot of times you guys send in a lot of stuff, and that's great because it helps us find what we need. And there's fewer questions that we have to come back with either on site or before we get out. But this is a good slide for anybody that's responsible for submitting documentation to say, oh yeah, what did she say we needed to send in? This is it. This is the information you need. Here is what that monitor review questionnaire looks like. Does the LURA for the development require supportive services? Yes. Is this the first monitoring review? NA, this one was not. This was like the 5th monitoring review. Does the LURA require a notary public? No. If you said yes, and that was a LURA requirement or an available service, I'm going to look for that when I come out. And I'm going to say, hey, who's the notary on site? And if you say, oh, we don't have a notary on site, I'm going to say, uh-oh, we got a little issue. If you say, oh, it's the manager, here's her sign, here's her stamp, that sort of thing, I'm going to say, great, check that off. Does the development require the community to make available on a regular scheduled basis a local nonprofit or government provider of services? No, that's that extra point thing that we talked about. Some LURAs require it, some don't. And then here is where it's going to ask you to outline. It says at the top, does the LURA have to have a per unit cost? The answer is no. This one did not. And then what service is offered and what's being provided. You can see here these folks offered credit counseling, financial planning, health and nutrition courses, and you can see what they've offered. And I was able to compare that to then what they submitted with regards to their sign-in sheets and flyers and newsletters. And I was able to show that they were their services went on to the next page of the review questionnaire as well. But I was able to show that there were services offered that satisfied the LURA requirements. Here's an example of a newsletter or calendar. This is something that is helpful. And I would go through with a little check mark and say, okay, we've got Rainbow Fitness, Rainbow Fitness, Rainbow Fitness. They are doing weekly exercise classes if that's the requirement of this one, that sort of thing. You can see we've got live youth academic support. So they've got somebody helping with homework a couple of days a week in their office. I think that's great. And that's outlined here. Here's an example of a flyer. This is something that we would anticipate you guys send out. Maybe it's a digital flyer, maybe it's a flyer that goes to every front door, maybe it's hung in the laundry room, or all of the above. That's great, but it needs to be provided. It needs to match the service that you've offered. If we see homebuyer education class and you're trying to tell us that that's satisfied adult education, that's probably not going to line up. That's probably going to be something that we're going to need to have a little bit more information on. We're going to expect to see a sign-in sheet. It's going to need to have the date, the service that was offered, what LURA service was it intended to qualify for, tenant signatures and maybe their apartment number or their phone number, something to kind of show that they really did come. And then if nobody attended, then the person signing it can across the bottom say no attendees, sign it and date it. I know that happens. But if there are attendees, they should be signed on here. And a lot of you, this is not an issue. So this is in here as a resource, but this is not in here as a, hey, you guys aren't doing this correctly thing. A common cause of non-compliance is trying to have one service that satisfies multiple things. So in this example, they've had somebody come in to do homebuyer education, financial literacy, and credit counseling, kind of all stacked on top of each other. That's not going to meet the requirement. This was one event. I'm going to say, which one did you want it to satisfy? If you've got 3 of these, I'm going to probably say, okay, that one goes to this, that one goes to this, and this one goes to this. But I'm not going to say that this one event satisfied all 3 things. But if you do it like this, for example, where you've got 9 to 10 on whatever day is homebuyer education, then you've got a brown bag lunch and learn for financial literacy, and then a third event later in the day from, like 3 to 4 in this example for credit counseling. I think that's a way that you can have one day. Maybe you have a provider that says, hey, I can come spend one day with you, but I can't spend 3 separate days in a quarter or a month or whatever. And you need to do it this way, but that provider would need to be there all day. There needs to be some definitive definition between each service and not between the, to where they don't look like they're kind of on top of each other. So we've got our last poll here. The mouse keeps falling asleep. Do we need to see evidence of every service ever offered when there is a monitoring review? Amy, do we have questions to talk about while this is up?
Nope, nothing right now.
We are nearing the end of our time on supportive services. Thank you guys for spending your day with us. While this is up, I do want to mention that if you are logging off after supportive services, you will be prompted to complete a survey. Please do that. I love your feedback. I love to know what other trainings you want to see. I love to see if I had shortfalls or what you really liked about this one, so that I can, better prepare or prepare additionally for future offerings. If you're staying on with us for the open forum office hours, then you will get that survey when you log off during the office hours. But that should pop up through your web browser when you exit the webinar. This will be recorded and posted on our website probably next week. So if you have staff that wasn't able to attend or you want to watch it again.
We have a question that came in.
Ooh, good. What you got?
It is, how long must we keep the documents?
We live in a digital age. So I'm going to say you can make those digital. You can have a folder for every year. You can get rid of the paper. And if we come out for a monitoring review, we would have looked at the stuff prior to that. You could probably archive those things at that time. And then you're working on a new term, because we're not going to look at 8-year-old documents when we come out for a monitoring review. Amy may have additional input on that.
Yeah, And 10.608 has record keeping requirements for each of the programs. So I would follow record keeping requirements for all documents for the programs. That's just how I
Also,
would do it.
I'm a hoarder, so I have my 2012 calendar still saved just in case I ever need it. So I'm probably more on the side of caution. There are 7 of them in my desk at the office.
Yeah, no. Here we have another question. If the residents don't want to sign the sign-in sheet for like food pantry, for example, should I write down their name and unit number on the sign-in sheet?
I think you could. Maybe a good point would be to not have the sign-in sheet be public. Maybe they check in with somebody in the office, they sign in, they go get their stuff, they check out, so to speak, so that maybe they don't want their neighbors to know that they needed help one month or something. I think that's a fair expectation there.
You can also assign confidential identification numbers for your tenants. And also there, because some of the service that are in land use restriction agreement are like counseling services, which obviously we do not want names or apartment numbers associated with that. So some kind of just identifier is probably best. Anonymously identifying them is probably best in situations like that. So yes, if it's a privacy concern, we want to honor that always.
Do we have any other questions? Are we ready to keep going?
No more questions.
Okay. So most of you said false. That is correct. I do not need to know what you did in 2017 for your supportive services. If I'm monitoring in 24, I want to know what you did in the 12 months prior, or what you have planned, or what you have planned for the next 12 months, kind of, especially if it's an annual service. But I don't need to know what you did 7 years ago. But if you need to know what I did 7 years ago, I have my planner. I can pull it out and tell you. I've watched too many crime shows and listened to too many podcasts. So what events qualify supportive services? We've kind of talked about this. I've joked about homebuyer education not being adult education. When you're looking at certain things, you need to use reasonable judgment. Adult education needs to be something like they would find as a computer proficiency course, or continuing education through like a community college in your area. Credit counseling, that's a whole nother service. So if your LURA says adult education or credit counseling, those aren't the same. That we would not have done that in most cases, I would think. So you need to think kind of inside the box of what realistically counts as that. And if you're not sure if it counts and it's too much of a stretch, we're probably going to think it's a stretch too. And depending on how big of a stretch it is, we might say, yeah, okay, we're going to count that this time, but we're going to give you technical assistance that says, hey, in the future, strengthen this course or strengthen this supportive service. But if it's truly meeting the requirement, then we're probably not going to give you the technical assistance that you need to strengthen that. We've talked about this. The supportive services monitoring begins with the first monitoring review. We're going to look at your plan that you have in place, or what services you've already offered, if you've offered any. And then going forward, we're going to look at a little more detailed review. We're going to look for sign-in sheets, flyers, newsletters, that sort of thing. And then we would want to see that there was the regularly scheduled information or offering of services, and that would need to be provided for monitoring reviews. With that, that completes everything I have for you. You can reach out by email or phone. You can stay on for the next hour and a half where we have our open forum office hours. We are going to pause and take a 5-minute break. And then we will start the office hours at 10:35, unless there are other questions, Amy, that we need to answer before we break.
Someone asked where they could find, I mentioned 10.608, and they wanted to know where they could find the rules. They are, we have a new website, and I put a link into the Secretary of State Texas Register, but they are also on our website, somewhere on our website.
Compliance manuals and rules.
Like there's a couple places that they are, but yes, under compliance, under manual and rules, subchapter F is there. And it is also on the Secretary of State Texas Register website, so you can find it on either one of those. Hey, Manuel. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Good morning. How are you all?
Good. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and do Q&As.
Did I get all our supportive services questions answered, Amy?
I got one that just came in. It says, so my property is post 15 and is up for sale, and the new owner has submitted a new tax credit application. So there will be 2 land use restriction agreements in place. Yes, that is correct, and you must comply with both. And if you need help with that, you can reach out to us, and we can look at that and tell you what you need to be doing in that situation. And that is all the supportive service questions, so we can go ahead and take our break, Kara.
All right, great. I'm going to stop the recording. This will be posted next week. Thank you, guys. Feel free to stay on for our question and answer open forum. And if you're logging off, thank you and have a great weekend.